Okay, guys, so as promised, the second video, could the Chinese military invade Australia? The first video, if you go back and have a look, is how they would get here and the strategic analysis of their fighter jets, their navy, etc. I believe this video is more to do with would they be able to, and how would they go about invading the continent itself. Let's have a look.
Previous video showed the initial stages of a war where China would try to reach Australia. No outside interference was assumed. These three distant Australian islands would likely find themselves under constant Chinese attacks. Air war and naval war would rage until one side breaks. Both sides operate dedicated standoff electronic jamming planes. Australian fleet is a known quantity, while exact number of Chinese planes is vague, as they're dual-use planes also used for combat. The air war outcome would be crucial for the course of the conflict. Chinese military is already powerful, but with the Cold War brewing, who knows how capable will it get in the future? Even years ago, germs of the incoming clash with China were visible.
I think the Cold War's here. This video was made in 2019, and the Cold War is well and truly underway, especially with trade relations and stuff like that, um, and human rights issues that Australia raised with China.
A very interesting documentary, China vs. USA: Empires at War, shows how each side viewed the possibility of a future conflict. I've watched it on Magellan TV, a new type of documentary streaming service, which is sponsoring this video. It was founded by filmmakers. Their producers and curators bring together premium content. I personally like history, technology and warfare stuff, but you can find quality videos on a bunch of other themes like the nature, culture or various biographies. The Empires at War deco struck me as a bad omen of things to come. Other documentaries like the Titans of War, talking about tank evolution, were also in-depth yet accessible. Streams feature no ads, and you can use the service on your TV, laptop or phone. Binkov's viewers get a special offer too. Just go to magellantv.com/Binkov's Battlegrounds and get a 1-month free membership trial. Check it out.
I'd normally take out those ads, but because we're using Binkov's videos, we keep them in there. Try and get him some sponsorship.
Let us get back to the air war down under. Australia would likely enjoy greater radar coverage, not just due to their OTH radars, but the surface radars on and around the outer islands, as well as the AWACS-like planes. While Chinese fleet is much larger on paper, their persistence would be minuscule. Of the listed ones, only the larger 4 Illusion-based planes have the reach to stay over Christmas Island for a few hours.
4 hours.
It would all mean Chinese might fare worse in situational awareness over the western islands, and air combat might incur greater losses for the Chinese, despite the relatively advanced fighter jets they would send to battle the Australian F-18s. Australia would likely be able to put thousands of troops on those islands and keep the islands restocked, but the surface fleet is likely to suffer.
One thing that hasn't been brought up is our pilots and our Navy are probably a little bit more experienced at the moment. I mean, we operated in the Gulf and off the Miao. Yeah, we've probably flown a few more missions and done a few more patrols than China has at the moment, as they're not at war and didn't engage with Afghanistan or Iraq or anything like that. So maybe that's a disadvantage for us. Who knows?
China would use its naval H-6 bombers to perform maritime strikes, aided by their long-range radar planes. It might not be enough for both islands though. Chinese assault on Christmas Island would thus have to be performed without ships, meaning with paratroopers only. They could only hope the missile barrage would neutralize Aussie defenses enough so the paradrop succeeds. Chinese Airborne Corps is pretty big, but it's limited here by not being able to use its medium-class planes. But Australia lacks proper ground air defenses completely. It has a single air defense unit armed with fairly short-range systems. So whatever ships survive Chinese attacks and whatever planes manage to be in the air during the paradrops would be defending the skies, which may initially be some.
A lot of this stuff, as I said, the video was filmed in 2019. A lot of this stuff has been negated. We realised that we were lacking the RBS 70. I think they're based down in Adelaide. Um, our shortfalls have been looked at and being improved. So yeah.
But Chinese could afford to repeat their attack several times, not actually sending the transports until they thin out the defenders. Since the islands are small, putting 10,000 troops for defense on them is out of the question. That would only lead to numerous deaths due to target density, while Chinese missiles fall all around. Plus 10,000 defenders
Airborne
per island means there
infantry
would be
fighting
barely any
vehicles.
experienced troops left defending mainland Australia. At the same time, the Eastern Front would be perhaps under even bigger pressure. The Norfolk Island would be very much under siege, but the Chinese force composition would be different there. Island is slightly closer to Australia, and China would have fewer planes. Basically, they would only have their single carrier, which
And closer to Sydney, a major harbour and a major city.
could serve for several months before having to return home. But it would be there, close by, so actual persistence of Chinese planes over target might be comparable to what Australia can send from that island. Chinese carrier jets are weaker than Australian Super Hornets, roughly as capable as Australian earlier Legacy Hornet fleet. Chinese would enjoy some pretty good radar coverage though, with numerous ships and their radars as well as a dozen helicopter-based aerial early warning units. Big Chinese advantage there would indeed be their navy. Chinese would likely send whatever they can to that front. Chinese fleet is pretty big, but the trip they would make is
That is
also
big.
big. They would spend some 2 weeks in one-way transit alone, leaving few months on station, and they would need to be resupplied as they reach Papua New Guinea. But Chinese resupply fleet has been gaining ships in recent
This is assuming they're not intercepted by the American, I think it's the Third Fleet.
decades.
Correct me if I'm wrong.
Their sole carrier has enough range to operate for some time before being refueled. Their other ships would usually require 2 or so
160,000 tons.
refuelings per deployment.
Wow.
Still, even with all the amphibious assault fleet and submarines, the Chinese would have enough supply ships to serve them close to Australia. Conventional submarines would take their time though. Going on average just 7 knots, they would need 3 to 4 weeks just to get to the battle theater. But they are important enough so Chinese would likely wait for them to begin their mission. Parked around Norfolk Island, they would force Australians to use a lot of their aerial anti-submarine assets, and would endanger Aussie ships protecting the island, eventually enabling Chinese fleet of air defense destroyers to cut off the island from Australia, and finally facilitate Chinese invasion of the island. Of course, all that would come
Wait,
at a
was that
steep cost to Chinese.
1950s tech?
Many
Hang on.
ships, possibly a few dozen, would be lost and facilitate Chinese invasion of the island.
Missed it.
Of course, destroyers to cut off the island
12 to 14 Ming-class submarines. 1950 to 2. Obviously, they've been retrofitted, but that's insane. That's World War II.
from Australia, and finally facilitate Chinese invasion of the island. Of course, all that would come at a steep cost to Chinese. Many ships, possibly a few dozen, would be lost in the effort by the time Australian Air Force isn't a factor anymore. But at the same time, after half a year or more, Australian Navy would be all but destroyed in the effort to deny those stepping stone islands to China. Its air force would probably be halved, and its stock of long-reach cruise missiles would be depleted. The reason for all this island hopping instead of landing near Sydney right away is that even the
Again, as I said, as the threats become more credible, these shortfalls have been negated, and we're looking at how we can improve that. Well, from what I understand, anyway.
big Chinese Navy can't perform Normandy-style mass landings so far away from China. Whole Chinese assault fleet is still insufficient for a single wave attack on Aussie mainland. A single cycle of Chinese ships going to Australia and returning home for a fresh load would take 3 to 4 weeks, depending on the route and exact point of landing. This still limits landings to a fairly small part of Australian northeastern coast. Even if Chinese managed to have almost entire of the landing fleet available at start, average availability of the ships through such multi-month campaign of going back and forth would drop. Without a taken port, most of those landing ships would be ferrying
50
supplies for
days.
existing troops, rather than fresh forces. Now let us look at what could oppose them. Regular troops shown are professionals. Active reserves are troops serving and training part-time, roughly equal to US National Guard.
It's important to the active reserve units up in this area are specifically trained for this kind of these kind of operations. So they're reconnaissance and interception. Um, Plus, we have, I think there's 3 battalions of infantry now in Townsville with everything that goes on. So probably not a very good place to land. Yeah, 20,000 maneuver troops. Plus the standby reserves as well. Yeah.
And standby reservists don't train much and feature limited readiness. For comparison,
Standby reserves don't train at all.
Chinese Marines and paratroopers would be among the more elite parts of their army. Each side would have certain issues to overcome. Australia would have to have forces defending at least 2,000 miles of coastline. Spreading those forces might not be prudent.
So, as I said, we've got 3 battalions already in about here, and 2 battalions of infantry here. Plus, obviously, armored elements, signal elements, everything you'd expect. So the east coast is pretty strong.
In such a case, even though with mass mobilization, Australia would likely add a few tens or hundreds of thousands of lightly armed troops, ex-civilians with little experience. Having bigger force groups farther away from
that wouldn't happen. I don't think. I can't imagine Australia ever using civilians to fight China.
the shore at certain points might be the way to go, because it's unlikely Chinese landing would be a complete surprise. But with smaller islands taken first, China would slowly bring in the front line to Australia. Eventually, China is likely to win control over the 3 outer islands and endanger Australian mainland from several sides. Australia would
Hypothetical casualties. 5,000 to 10,000 soldiers. Look at the difference though. 10 to 40,000. 50 ships and subs. Hundreds of various military planes. I mean, in comparison, population-wise, it's pretty bad, but it looks a lot worse.
by that point be pretty much mobilized. That means the initial tens of thousands of soldiers would be augmented by roughly 5 to 10% of the entire population, probably closer to 5%, as 10% was achieved only by few countries back when nationalistic spirit was high during World War II. Great majority of those troops would however be very lightly armed. Australia would surely somehow buy assault rifles and basic equipment from the black market.
I doubt that very much. It's true, we don't have many firearms here. They're illegal unless you have a license, and even then, they're very restricted. But we do make our own firearms for our own defence force. I don't think it would be too much of a problem, and I don't think we'll be sending civilian freedom fighters. I think that would be probably either conscripted in this case, or they'd recall ex-military back into the army or navy or air force. But this is a bit ridiculous, calculating current Australian gun quantities.
But getting larger and more complex equipment takes time in no allies environment of this scenario, where each purchase goes through the foreign manufacturers rather than through foreign government. China would have an upper hand there, with their military receiving domestic-made weapons. But China would not be able to enforce a blockade. Even if it held those outer islands and turned them into temporary bases for some of their ships, Australia is simply too large to be surrounded by a blockade, and there are too many commercial ships passing through the area to inspect them and block them, without pissing off most of the third-party countries.
Exactly.
Time would work in Chinese favor though. With those outer islands taken, Chinese could construct ports on them and use commercial-grade shipping to haul in supplies and arms on a large scale, using upward of 20 large
civilian lift fleet could transport. So they're going to do a Dunkirk to Australia? Seems strange. I think they're focusing a lot on civilians here, but
Ro-Ro ships. After 12 to 18 months, Chinese might be ready for the second stage of their invasion, threatening the beaches of mainland Australia. Even with over 1 million soldiers, covering all the areas would be impossible. Chinese invasion would by that point also include a better part of their total land forces. Various militia and reservists would also likely be mobilized. As Chinese bring in fresh planes and ships and base them fairly close, Australian Air Force would
Hopeless.
be on the losing side, relegated to occasional harassment strikes. By that point, Australian Navy would likely be destroyed for the most part. China could still choose whether to go for mainland first or to keep slicing away, taking some other islands. Bathurst Island up in the north and
Tasmania, I very much doubt. We've got New Zealand right here. Um, we've got Melbourne here as well, with an Air Force base. Yeah, I think Tasmania would be rather hard to invade, especially the country surrounding it.
especially Tasmania in the south, might be targets of choice for China. Again, putting 500,000 of Australian soldiers on Tasmania to make sure Chinese invasion fails likely means those soldiers get trapped on the island, as Chinese Navy parks itself in between and cuts the island off. So the likely outcome is that Tasmania would get lighter protection and would eventually fall, even if it takes some more months and tens of thousands of Chinese casualties. With such a large island and its infrastructure, China could bide its time and create a force for one final push,
That's true.
even if it meant Sydney or Melbourne get surrounded by Chinese troops 2 years after start of the hostilities. Whatever heavy weapons Australia could muster and buy in the meantime would still not be enough compared to what China could steadily land all around the country, even if Australia managed to purchase a few times more vehicles than it has today. The million new Australian soldiers may get decent training when it comes to individual combat, but scaling up training to brigade-sized units with combined heavy arms.
So this is changing. I think we're going to have up to 140 Abrams. The new boxes, the ASLAVs, as well as the Bushmaster vehicles, the M113s, pretty useless to be honest. Um, we're definitely outnumbered when it comes to Chinese forces, uh, and probably a little bit outgunned. Um,
Would likely be lacking, as Australia would lack the seasoned officer numbers and heavy systems to take advantage of the combined arms offensives. Chinese edge and satellite surveillance and their numerous fleet of drones and recon platforms would mean they would get to choose where to disembark, picking areas which are
so again, this whole eastern coast would be a bad idea to land. I can't see him landing there with 5 infantry battalions, and that's just the infantry alone. We've got, I think, 3 to 5,000 Marines plus our own armored battalion and infantry battalions up here. SASR are here. Uh, yeah, makes it quite difficult. Lots of thick jungle fighting here and all across here, so it would be a long, bloody war.
not as heavily defended. Chinese air support and fire support edge would then ensure those disembarked troops would stay on the beach and slowly build up their numbers. Within 2 years, it's likely Australia would be cut up in isolated areas under Australian control and vast swaths of land without any troops. So, a multi-year war would result in total Chinese victory. The scale of two economies and the imposed rule of no allies make sure of that. But it's also important to note that China would run into great problems in the first year of the conflict, even with the no allies rule. If a 1-year limit is imposed, Chinese victory would then be labeled as a minor one due to excessive Chinese casualties. And if no other countries are passable, such as Indonesia, then Chinese options would get severely limited, and Aussies could concentrate their defenses in one spot. In such an event, it would take even longer for China to make meaningful gains.
Alright, so I know the video continually keeps saying no allies, but this was filmed in 2019, and with AUKUS and ANZUS and a few other treaties with Indonesia and such, the fact that Australia could defend itself for this long and cause this much of attrition to Chinese defense force is pretty much testament that it would be pretty hard, if not impossible, not impossible, but very, very hard with the help of America, the UK, um, pretty much will be NATO, to be honest. It will just depend on whether Russia teams up with China. But I think what's much more likely is we'd see a trade war, which is currently happening now, and buy up land and stuff like that. I can't tell you it's ever happening. It's just too costly for anybody. Such a big place to take over, and yeah, let's hope it doesn't happen because it would literally be World War Three. Um, I'd be island hopping again. There'd be lots of conflict and probably nukes if Australia did get taken over. Who knows? I'm not that smart. I'm just the next grunt, and that's my opinion. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and yeah, let me know. Let me know your opinion. Cheers, guys.